Let's get started. Welcome back. And you know, it's not 130 people like it was 2 days ago, but I am just amazed at how many of you continue to come. I can't seem to get rid of you, no matter how hard I make it. So, welcome back to this class, Rational Foundations for a Christian Worldview. We've been talking about a handful of issues that are fundamental for any person forming a worldview, right? Just trying to make sense of the world. And we are examining, of course, the Christian answers, the Christian views on those issues, and we are especially interested to discuss what reason there is to believe what Christians have to say about these things. We started, if you can still remember back a few days, we started by talking about faith and reason, and I just tried to set the stage by encouraging you all to think of there being a positive relationship between faith and reason, right? Faith is bolstered by reason. The more evidence, the more reason you get for the tenets of the Christian faith, actually, the more your faith will increase. And actually, I tried to persuade you that the kind of faith that Jesus calls his followers to actually requires you to use your mind. So then we tried to kick it into gear and say, okay, let's use our minds to explore this issue, this basic question: is there a God? How can we know, right? The existence of God. And I said, if you think of proof as just demonstrating the truth of something, giving a sound argument, providing sufficient reason, yeah, there's lots of proof for the existence of the Christian God. And then we said, okay, but that doesn't quite get you to Christianity, right? There are lots of different variations of theism out there that subscribe to something like the Christian God, the classical conception of God. What separates Christianity is the unique things it says about Jesus. And so if you're looking for a sorting principle to decide between Christianity and all of the other worldviews, you investigate the unique claims about Jesus, right? And I took you through this historical argument for the resurrection, and the idea there was there's really only one plausible hypothesis that captures all of the historical data that we have surrounding the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that gets you, the first 3 sessions are meant to get us to a place where you could see positively what reason there is to believe the Christian worldview generally, right? The basic claims, theism, the attributes of God, and the resurrection of Jesus. So that's a good place to get to. Like, you don't have to be an idiot to believe Christianity. But of course, there are also objections, right? There are rational objections to the Christian faith. And this session and tomorrow, I'm going to focus on 2 objections. Today, we'll do the argument from evil. Tomorrow, we'll talk about Christianity and science, objections from science. So, like I said, it's one thing to show, hey, you don't have to be a dummy to believe this stuff, but can the Christian worldview sort of survive scrutiny? Can it withstand, or are there good responses to some of the more powerful objections to Christianity? We're going to tackle a couple of those, starting with the problem of evil. So the topic today is really the goodness of God and how we can square the idea of a good and perfect God with the existence of evil and suffering in the world. It's probably the most powerful argument against the Christian worldview. It's certainly the argument against the Christian worldview with the longest history. I'm going to let Tim Keller set the stage for us again. This is from his book again, The Reason for God. He's got a couple of these conversations recorded with people that he's talked to again, okay? So here's Hillary. She's an undergraduate English major. She says, I just don't believe that the God of Christianity exists. God, if he exists, he allows terrible suffering in the world. So he might be all-powerful, but not good enough to end evil and suffering, or else he might be all good, but not powerful enough to end evil and suffering. Either way, the all-good, all-powerful God of the Bible could not exist. And Hillary's boyfriend, Rob, chimes in. He says, this isn't really a philosophical issue to me. This is personal. I won't believe in a God who allows suffering, even if he, she, or it does exist. Maybe God exists, maybe it doesn't, but if he does, he can't be trusted. Here's Keller. He says, for many people, it's not the exclusivity of Christianity that we talked about yesterday. It's not exclusivity that's the biggest problem. It's the presence of evil and suffering in the world. Some find it to be a philosophical problem, calling into question the very existence of God. For others, it's an intensely personal issue. They just refuse to believe in a God who allows the world to proceed as it has. In December 2004, massive tsunami killed more than 250,000 people around the rim of the Indian Ocean. Over the following weeks, newspapers and magazines were full of letters and articles asking, where was God? One reporter wrote, if God is God, then he's not good, but if he's good, then he's not God. You just can't have it both ways after such a catastrophe. You can imagine similar columns being written today or in the past few years, right? Where is God in the pandemic? Where is God in the war over in Ukraine? Where is God right now? As I just read reports that people in Hawaii are literally running into the ocean to escape wildfires. Like, where is God? The problem of evil survives because there's never any shortage of bad news in the world, right? There's always something it seems like you can look at and ask the question, how could a perfect God, how could a good and loving God specifically allow this sort of thing to happen? Here's the main idea I want to offer you, and I will explain it, okay? God explains and substantiates evil and goodness, or more fully, the existence of the Christian God is both the best explanation of the evil and goodness in the world and the best substantiation of the evil and goodness in the world. What do I mean by that? Explanation we've talked a lot about, right? Why do we see the evil and goodness in the world that we do? The existence of the Christian God is our best explanation. But substantiation, how do we make sense of it? How do we see it as something that's not pointless, something with meaning, something with significance? The existence of the Christian God, I want to persuade you, is the best hope you have of that as well. So we're going to explain the evil and suffering in the world and also try to substantiate it, give it some meaning. Okay? Here's a plan. I want to separate two questions for you, okay? One question is whether the existence of evil in the world sort of logically rules out the existence of a perfect God. Is the existence of evil incompatible with the existence of God? That's what we'll do first. That's called the logical problem of evil. A slightly different question is this more personal or slightly more emotional question, I guess you could say. How could God, or why would God allow evil and suffering in the world? Okay, those are two different questions. I'm going to separate them. We're going to tackle the incompatibility question first, and then we're going to tackle the question of theodicy, right? That's what theologians call it when you try to provide an account that makes sense of the suffering in the world, okay? And then, as always, I want to end with a few talking points, how you dialogue with others about this issue. So here we go. We're going to try to get a stable account. I want to frame the next few moments with this thought. What I want to offer you is this idea that what the Christian worldview has to say about this is internally consistent and externally defensible. That is, internally consistent. It's coherent. It's free from contradiction. You can say that there's a Christian God and say that there's evil in the world and not contradict yourself, right? That's a kind of a low bar, right? Just don't contradict yourself. Can you also defend yourself externally defensible? Is it plausible objectively? Can it survive objections? Okay, so we want to get coherence, yes, but also we want to see how the Christian account of evil in the world is sort of stable and can withstand rational scrutiny. So here we go. Here's a quote from David Hume, the modern philosopher, in his Dialogues of Natural Religion, and he's borrowing from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. So the problem of evil in its philosophical form is a couple thousand years old. It's not a new argument. It's been discussed and thought about for thousands of years. So here's Hume. He says, Epicurus' old questions are still unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's impotent. He's not omnipotent. He lacks power. Maybe he has the power, but if he's able, is he not willing to eliminate the evil? Well, then he's malevolent. Then he wouldn't be good. Is he both able and willing? Is he both powerful and good? Whence then is evil? That is, if God were willing to eliminate all the evil in the world, and he could, how could there be any evil? Here's J.L. Mackie. He's a philosopher who is perhaps the most formidable proponent of the logical problem of evil in the last 100 years. This is in his book, Evil and Omnipotence. He explains it this way. Here's the old problem in its simplest form is this. God's omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet there is evil in the world. There seems to be contradiction between these three things, so that if any of two of them were true, the third could not be true. But here's the catch, right? All three are essential parts of most theological positions, right? Most theisms endorse all three of these positions. God's good, God is powerful, but there's evil, and the charge is there's some kind of incoherence, some contradiction, some inconsistency in holding all three of those things. Okay? So, what is the problem of evil in a nutshell, right? It's an argument. We've talked a lot about arguments, so I don't need to explain that. The conclusion of the argument is supposed to be that the classical Christian God can't exist, right? That's the conclusion the argument is driving towards. And particularly, the crucial premise is that there's evil in the world. How do you square the existence of evil with the existence of this God? Often, I think, and most persuasively, the argument is put in the form of a paradox, right? You're just encouraged to stare at this quartet of propositions here and feel the tension, right? God is all powerful, that's what we call omnipotence. God is all good, that's omnibenevolence. And actually, I think you need omniscience. I'm gonna help our opponents out a little bit. I think you need omniscience to make the problem really stick. God is all knowing, and yet there's evil. And again, the allegation is you can't have all of those things. That is to say, some crucial piece of the Christian worldview has got to be false, right? Because all three or four of these things can't be true. Now, you might be looking at the screen and looking at those four claims and thinking like, wait a second, that's what I believe. And you might be thinking like, look, I'm not like an academic 20th century philosopher, but like I'm not exactly an idiot, and I don't see the problem. Like I don't see immediately how these things contradict each other. And actually, Mackie says in this famous paper, Evil and Omnipotence, he says actually there is no immediate contradiction. In other words, if you just take these four claims by themselves, there's no contradiction yet. The contradiction comes, how? You need some additional premises. You need some additional claims, some additional principles. I want to pause there, right? Don't let that go by you too quickly, right? If you're looking at these four claims and thinking, I don't see the contradiction, you're right. To get a contradiction, you need to think of the attributes of God and the nature of evil in a specific way. Okay, and Mackie provides the supplemental principles. He says, additional principles are, good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. So we have kind of a definition of what it would mean for God to be good. So God is all good, and what that means is he eliminates all evil he possibly can. And God is all powerful, and what that means is there aren't any limits on what God can do. And now you can see the problem, hopefully, right? If there are no limits on what God can do, if he can do anything, and he wants to eliminate all evil as far as he can, now you have a real puzzle on your hands. How could it seems to follow from those two ideas that there couldn't be evil in the world? Okay, what should the Christians say about this? I actually think Mackie's observation his observation that you need additional principles to get the contradiction actually provides the strategy for responding. And the strategy is pretty simple. Christians don't say these things. We don't think of omnipotence and omnibenevolence this way. So what I want to do is spend a couple minutes just talking about those two concepts and giving you a more stable way to think about them. Let's tackle omnipotence first. Mackey says we should think of omnipotence as a sort of unlimited power, unlimited ability to act. There's no limits on what the being can do. There's a lot of things to say here, but I just want to point out two problems with thinking of omnipotence this way, okay? The basic point here is that thinking of omnipotence as unlimited ability to act leads itself to incoherence, okay? First point, there are just some things that cannot come to pass in and of themselves. Okay, let me give you some examples. There can't be square circles. 2 and 2 can't make 5. John can't both be a bachelor and be married. These are just things that can't happen. Okay, so there are some things, some events, some states of the affairs that are just in themselves impossible. So if you say that there's a being that can do anything, you'd be committed to these kinds of incoherences where you start saying things that make no sense. Like, yeah, God could make a triangle with 2 sides. It's like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. We don't want to say that. Okay, so first of all, thinking of omnipotence in this way leads to incoherence. Second of all, thinking of omnipotence in this way actually undermines the argument from evil. You'll like this. This is a nice little trick. Watch this. Okay, if God can do literally anything, if there are no limits on what he can do, literally no limits, well, here's a thing. He could make all 4 of these claims true. You see what I'm getting at? If God can do anything, he can make there be true contradictions. But if these things could contradict each other and still be true, there's no problem of evil. Right? The whole problem is supposed to be these things contradict each other, so one of them must be false. But if God can do things like make square circles and make 2-sided triangles, he could certainly defy the laws of logic and make these things cohere. So thinking of omnipotence in this way is in itself leads to philosophical problems, but it also undercuts the argument from evil. So I would suggest that you think of omnipotence in the way that many theologians, at least since the scholastics, like Anselm and Aquinas, have thought of it, as an aspect of God's perfection. So omnipotence isn't unlimited power, it's perfect power. It means God's not lacking anything with respect to power, or if you like, there's nothing God should be able to do that he can't do, or maybe a little bit more technically, God can do, this is usually what I say, God's omnipotence means that he can do anything that can be done. Right? You can see how that still distinguishes God's powers from us, right? There are all sorts of things that are possible that are not possible by us. God's omnipotence means he can do anything that can be done. If you say that, you don't have to say weird things about 2-sided triangles, right? You just say there can't be 2-sided triangles. It's not a limit on God's power to say he can't make a 2-sided triangle. We just mean he can do anything that's possible. Okay. First point about omnipotence. Let's move to omnibenevolence. I'm going to say the same thing. I want you to think of omnibenevolence as an aspect of God's perfection. So omnibenevolence is perfect goodness. Here's the upshot. If you think of what it would mean to be perfectly good, would you actually say that a perfectly good being would eliminate all evil that it could? Let me give you a few sort of intuition pumps to get you thinking about this, okay? My students often complain that I make their heads hurt. Maybe some of you have such a complaint after the past few days. Now, I'm not cruel, but sometimes I take that as a compliment. I take it as a sign that I'm doing something right, because real learning requires some challenge, right? It's going to require some toil. You got to stretch yourself a little bit. If there's no discomfort, no work, no suffering at all, you're probably not learning very much, right? So a good teacher is going to inflict some mental pain on their students. So think about parenting. Some of you maybe have seen, if you guys are looking for chairs, you can pull chairs from the other room if you want. A good parent, I think you would say similar things about. Some of you maybe have seen my wife and kids running around. I have a 7-year-old, 5-year-old, and 2-year-old daughter. Thank the Lord, they all can walk. They don't come out the womb that way. Also, thank the Lord for that. You have to teach them, right? Now, here's something that you can do, right? My wife and I could have decided, okay, when it comes time for walking, we're going to sort of like take the helicopter thing to the max. Anytime they might fall or run into something, we're going to swoop in, we're going to stabilize them, and make sure there's no falling, there's no bumping into things, there's no pain. Now, we didn't make that choice. As almost every parent does, we saw, it's probably better to expedite this process. And pain is an effective teacher. It's also good for them to learn that, like, if they don't walk in certain ways, they're going to experience some pain, right? So we made the call, like, as good parents, it's better for you to do it this way. You're going to undergo some pain, but overall your life will be better if you do it this way. You could do similar analogies to governance, for example. There are all kinds of things the government could prevent, but for example, in classically liberal or democratic states, countries like the US, we decide the government better not do that because of the value of individual freedom, for example. Right? So what are the point? The point I'm driving you towards is the perfectly good being isn't going to try to prevent all possible badness. A perfectly good being is going to try to bring about the best overall state. And the best overall state may include some pain and suffering, but it includes so much more goodness that on the whole, things are better. Okay? That's what the examples are for, just to warm you up to that thought. Okay, so think of omnibenevolence as perfect power, not unlimited ability to act. Think of omnibenevolence as perfect goodness, caring about the overall good, not just the elimination of badness. And the logical problem dissolves, right? Remember, Mackey said you only get a contradiction if you think of omnipotence and omnibenevolence in a specific way. And what we're saying is, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't say that. You should think of omnipotence and omnibenevolence differently. So, we're right back where we were, right? We're staring at this quartet of propositions and thinking, I don't see the contradiction. The reason there's no contradiction is that if you think of God's attributes in specific ways, they're perfectly coherent. And it's perfectly coherent with the existence of evil in the world. The contradiction only arises if you think of God's attributes in a specific way. So actually, what feels like a very powerful argument, at first, is fairly easy to see, has some pretty glaring weaknesses. I'll read to you from J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. They say, remember, it's the atheist that claims to have discerned a contradiction in the theist's truth claim, so it's the atheist that bears the burden of proof to demonstrate that. That's why Mackey supplies the additional principles, right? If you don't see the contradiction, he's got to show it to you, and he gives you the additional principles. And you might say, well, now I see it. And then we walked our way out of that. He says, this burden has proved to be enormously heavy, actually unbearable. Which is why, after centuries of discussion, contemporary philosophers, including atheists and agnostics, have come to recognize the fact, and it is now widely admitted, that the logical problem of evil has been solved. This is anecdotal, but it may be of interest to you that I teach the logical problem of evil in philosophy classes only for historical value. when it comes time to give the real problem of evil, I never give this version because everybody knows that this problem has been solved. So now, let's not lose sight of what the problem is, and we're going to try to help the opponent out. Let's reconfigure the argument and give it another try. Right? Even if you don't think the existence of evil is logically incompatible with the existence of a perfect God, you might still think something like this. Couldn't the world be a better place than it is? You could think of this on a large scale, like the Holocaust. Did we really need that? Did that have to happen? Or you could zoom in to more micro, like couldn't there be just one less infant that dies of cancer? Like just one. Couldn't there be one? And that would improve the world, right? The world could be a better place than it is, intuitively. This comes from the modern philosopher Leibniz. He formulated the argument once this way. A perfect being will always make the best choice. But look around the world. It seems like the world could be a better place than it is. So God didn't bring about the best possible world, so God didn't make the best choice. A perfect being always makes the best choice, so God can't be perfect. What do we say about this? Well, is this the best possible world? That's the charge, right? This is not the best possible world, and if God were perfect, he would have brought about the best possible world. It's a little trickier here, but stay with me, okay? If this is not the best possible world, that would mean there's got to be some sort of trade-off that could be made, right? For example, you could remove one infant with cancer, and there wouldn't be any corresponding trade-offs, right? You could remove the evil in the world without removing any corresponding goodness, and so the overall balance of good to evil in the world is improved, right? Or vice versa, right? You could add some goodness without introducing any new evil, and so the overall balance is improved. Here's the issue. Well, what I have here in the orange here. For any evil in the world, it's possible, it's at least possible, that it's accompanied by a greater good. Now, I want you to take this seriously. When it says any evil, we mean any evil, okay? So, yes, catastrophically horrible events like the Holocaust. It looks terrible. It looks overall obviously bad. But isn't it at least possible that, say, in 1,000,000 years, the events of the Holocaust are seen to unfold in billions of little different ways, that actually, on the whole, the world is better off? We may not be able to see it now, but it's at least a possibility. Why is that important, right? Well, remember, the burden is on the atheist. The atheist, or the opponent of theism, needs to be able to say, here's a trade-off you could definitely make that would definitely improve the world. And the undercutting defeater, the response is, well, how do you know these evils aren't in fact accompanied by a greater good? And so if you remove these evils, you're actually making the world worse. For example, right, you might think, and this is something my students often ask me, like, wouldn't it be better, let's do a little thought experiment. If you came back from the future and you knew Hitler as a kid, like, wouldn't you just take care of that? You'd certainly be tempted to, right? But look, how do things unfold after that? I mean, maybe there's no Hitler, but then Stalin is twice the maniac that he was, and the level of evil in the world is exactly the same. It's at least possible, right? And the burden for the theist is to show that there is definitely a better state that the world could be in. If the atheist can't meet that burden, the logical problem of evil and this evidential problem of evil doesn't go through. The point is, the existence of evil in the world is only evidence against the existence of God if it couldn't be accompanied by a greater good. As long as it could be accompanied by a greater good, it's possible possible. We're living in the best possible world. It's possible God made the best choice. And again, the burden on the theist is to show that he definitely didn't. Here's Moreland and Craig again. They say, part of the problem here is that we're just not in a very good position to assess with confidence the probability that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evils to occur. That's another way of thinking about these trade-offs, right? Is it possible that God has morally good reasons for allowing things to unfold the way that they have? As long as you say yes to that, it's hard to establish the claim that God hasn't made the best choices, right? Whether God's existence is improbable relative to the evil in the world depends on how probable it is God has good reasons for permitting the evil in the world. It's difficult to assess these probabilities because we're just not in a good position to make these kinds of probability judgments with any kind of confidence. As finite persons, we're limited by time, space, intelligence, and insight. A transcendent and sovereign being can see the end of history from its beginning and providentially order history so that his purposes are achieved. In order to achieve his ends, which are good, God may well have to put up with certain evils along the way. Evils that appear pointless or unnecessary to us may, after it's all said and done, be seen to be justly permitted from the sort of God's eye view. Okay, so we've switched from the logical problem of evil. We said that one's easy. There's no contradiction here. But does the existence of evil still provide some evidence against the existence of God? And the response is, well, maybe. But how strong the evidence is depends on how likely it is that God could have a good reason for allowing it to happen. Okay? So, I'm going to leave you with this in this section. Right? We just showed evil is certainly not inconsistent with the existence of a perfect God. And it's only evidence against the Christian God if it could not be accompanied by a greater good. Okay? How are we doing? Pretty good. Pretty good. 60-second break. Stretch your legs. We're going to come back and we're going to dig into the theodicy. Okay? I think I will make a few minutes for questions right now, because after we move on, I'm going to leave the logical problem in the dust and we're going to move towards theodicy. So think about whether you have a burning question. We may do questions for a couple minutes and then we'll move on. Okay, take a 60-second break.
As history unfolded and been able to balance and say, yes, more good has come out of it than evil, or any other example?
Yeah, the question is, has any historian actually looked at an event like the Holocaust and sort of conjectured or said, like, actually that was for the good, for the greater good? I don't know of any examples on that specific case. I mean, I know that people who work on military history and geopolitics certainly write about counterfactuals, like, what if, the Archduke wasn't assassinated, then, was the war inevitable? Like, historians and scholars do work on things like that. I have never encountered anything like what you just mentioned. Yeah.
So theologically, do you allow for the possibility, we've talked about specific examples, i.e. Holocaust and cancer. Yeah. But just the general concept that God in his infinite wisdom would allow via free will evil to enter the world and wreak havoc.
Yes, but now you're doing theodicy.
Oh, so that's the next section.
Yeah. The free will defense is a piece of theodicy that says, okay, now that we know that God is compatible with evil, how could a God like that, or why would a God like that allow evil like this? And the appeal to freedom is one answer that we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Similar question. It's easy to answer the evil question with the free will.
Yeah.
The harder question, which I have been asked by agnostics, is, well, then what about the big catastrophes? That doesn't explain free will by man.
Such as what?
Like
Tsunami.
big floods or tsunamis.
Okay,
A lot of things.
good. So philosophers often draw a line between human evils and what are called natural evils. So tsunamis, wildfires, maybe we still don't know what box the pandemic goes in, I don't know. But it does seem, I mean, I do think if you're being fair-minded, you will concede it's less easy to see how human freedom could be responsible for the natural evils, right? And that's a harder connection for people to make. Like, how does human sin mean that a tsunami kills 250,000 people? You may hate me for this, but I'm gonna punt until we go through the theodicy bit. I think there is a satisfying answer, but I think you need to take on a good bit of the Christian worldview before you can see that it is satisfying. So,
Because otherwise I'm leaving.
It sounds like you're equating the word.
Stay tuned tomorrow, same station.
Evil and so her question was, it seems like I'm equating the word evil with suffering. I usually say evil and suffering to indicate that they are distinct. Suffering, you might just think of as something like, usually if anything, I'll equate suffering with pain or unhappiness. Whereas evils could include, say, morally wrong actions that don't necessarily cause suffering. So they're not meant to be the same. That's why we want to capture both. Yeah. Okay, maybe one more.
Well, I've yet to hear a person's personal testimony saying that God was so good I just had to trust him. You know, my life was in the pits. I needed a way out, and God presented himself.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so maybe evil is a way of God showing us that we can't do this on our own.
Sure.
We need him.
Might be true, but we're doing theodicy again. Yeah, and I think, look, I mean, maybe that's an obnoxious refrain, but I do think it's important to separate the two, and you do have to be able to tackle the issue of, like, how could the existence of God and the existence of evil be compatible? It's one thing to say nice fluffy things about why God might allow evil into the world, but that's all useless if evil literally contradicts and logically rules out the existence of such a God, right? So I think both tasks need to be tackled. It seems like the questions have to do with theodicy, so why don't we, like, let's just go. We're just gonna go. I'll try to make time for more questions at the end. It seemed like there have been questions every session, and so I'll try to be efficient here. Let's see. Okay, here's Mackey, our old friend Mackey. A few years later, in this book, The Miracle of Theism, he says, there is a good defense against the logical problem of evil. Its principles, like the way we've been talking about omnipotence and omnibenevolence, its principles involve no abandonment of our ordinary view of good and evil. So we can concede that the problem of evil doesn't show, after all, that the doctrines of theism are inconsistent with one another. Again, this is one of the most prominent proponents of the logical problem of evil, basically saying, yeah, there's a good response. There is a good and intellectually acceptable response to the logical problem of evil. Whether this offers a real solution is another question. And I think the reason Mackey is saying that is because we haven't done anything like the last few questions. We haven't done anything in the realm of a theodicy that would provide a satisfying explanation as to why there is evil in the world, or how could it be that God would let things go this way. So let's move there. Let's move to theodicy. Again, what we're doing in theodicy is we're not addressing the objection that God doesn't exist. The question is now, assuming that he does exist, what resources does that give us for explaining the evil and suffering in the world? And what I want to offer you is this, okay? The Christian account does two things that any good account should. One, it rules out what I say are harrowing answers and puts forth hopeful answers. That is, the Christian story is one on which you rule out accounts of evil in the world that would lead you to despair. And there are accounts of evil in the world that should lead you to despair. it rules those answers out and gives you some reason for hope. It paints a picture on which you can have hope in the goodness of God and the way things are headed, despite the evil in the world. Okay, so I want to make one quick note before we move on, and I'm going to do something I've never done before. This next few slides, I'm just going to blast through them. I'm used to doing these sessions, I was telling someone before. I'm used to having 2 to 3 hours for each of these sessions. So like I'm trying to down to an hour and a half. So I'm going to speed through this, but we can always come back, okay? I want to make one important note. Remember, again, what I just said, what we're doing when we're doing a theodicy. The question is, assuming that the Christian worldview is true, how can we make sense of the evil and the suffering in the world? Okay, you can see why it's important to separate the incompatibility problem with the theodicy problem, because from now on, I'm going to talk as if the Christian worldview is true. I'm not going to defend it. I'm assuming that it's true. That's not cheating. That's just what you're doing when you're doing a theodicy, right? The question is, on the assumption that Christianity is right, do we have good explanatory resources here? Okay? Just want to make that super clear, because sometimes people will say, well, you're just assuming there is a God. Yes, I am, because that's the task now, right? We already showed evil is inconsistent with God. Now we're going to say, assuming there is such a God, what does that view have to say about the evil and suffering in the world? Okay? Remember we just talked about the attributes of God. Don't lose sight of this, okay? God's omnipotence, God's omnibenevolence. There are too many accounts of the evil and suffering in the world that compromise on these things, okay? So be careful. I would encourage you when you talk to people about this, don't compromise. Your answer should not be some version of just like, well, you know, God's hands are tied. He just can't do it. He just can't get it done, you know? God's not strong enough. Right? In the Christian worldview, God's perfect in power, right? He lacks no power. And the nice thing about the Christian worldview is we know the end of the story. Right? We have prophets like Isaiah, Daniel, we have the Revelation, right? And we know at the end of all things, there will be a nice war and Jesus wins, right? And look at these statements. I love a beautiful passage in Revelation 21, hearkening back to Isaiah 11. There will no longer be any death or mourning or pain. All things will be made new. Right, so the Christian answer about, well, how could there be evil is not, well, you know, there's just some things God can't do anything about. The answer is more like, be patient. It's coming. God is opposed to the evil and suffering in the world, and He will set it right. He can and He will. Also, don't compromise on God's love, right? It's not like, yeah, there are some evils that just aren't that important to God. He's prioritizing the big stuff, you know? He's about the saving of souls, and then, you know, if people's lives aren't very good, it's no big deal. That's not the picture, right? Remember, the crucial tenet of Christianity is that God sent His Son to die for us. Right? 1 John 3:16, this is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down His life for us, and now Romans 8, nothing can separate us from that love. God is going to do what it takes to provide for our good, because He has perfect love for us. Okay? So it's helpful to remember God's omnipotence and omnibenevolence, right? We don't want to say something that would suggest that evil and suffering in the world is somehow a result of God's lacking power or lacking goodness, okay? Okay, so now I'm gonna move, right? So what's the upshot there? Whatever the explanation of the evil and the suffering in the world is, we know what it's not, right? On the Christian worldview, we know what it's not. The answer is not that God doesn't care, and the answer is not that God can't do anything about it, okay? God has perfect goodness, perfect power. Okay, so what is the explanation? How do we do this? How do we make sense of suffering? I want to give you 3 criteria before we actually do the theodicy. I want to give you 3 criteria that any account of the evil and suffering in the world should satisfy. It's helpful to keep in mind, remember, Christians aren't the only ones that need to explain the evil and suffering in the world. Right? Anyone building a worldview needs to face up to this question. Here are 3 criteria, okay? A good account, a good theory will do these 3 things. 1, explain the source of suffering. Where does it come from? 2, justify the presence of suffering. How could it somehow be a good thing, or what good reasons could there be for the evil and suffering in the world? And 3, substantiate it with significance. Tell a story that shows that it's not pointless. There's some purpose to it. We're not suffering for no reason. It's meaningful. An account that doesn't satisfy all 3 of those criteria would give you reason to despair, right? It's like, yeah, we don't know where all the evil is coming from. It's just coming at us from every angle, but who knows where or why or what it all means. Life is just terrible, and then you die for no reason. Right? A good account is going to check all 3 of these boxes. So, I want to give you 3 general resources that the Christian worldview has, and then I'll say a few things about each of them. And what I'm trying to do is just paint a general picture here, right? The theological question is, again, if the Christian worldview is true, what resources do we have at our disposal to make sense of the evil and the suffering in the world? And I just want to give you 3 different approaches, okay? 1, soul-making. Soul-making theodicies, the core insight of soul-making theodicies is this idea that God is forming us. God is forming our souls. He's forming us into creatures fit for eternal bliss. Or I like C.S. Lewis's phrase, he's forming us into creatures that will be at home in the kingdom of God. Okay? 2, freedom, or free will defense. For my money, the person who does this best is Alvin Plantinga, but you can find lots of philosophers and theologians discussing the free will defense. Freedom is a good thing, but the presence of the kind of freedom we value requires the possibility of evil and suffering. 3rd, and this is probably the one you hear about the least because it's the one that Christians have the least fun talking about, especially to non-believers, justice. If God is perfect, God is just. And justice requires opposition to evil and may require actually the administration of some pain. Okay? 3 completely different ways of looking at the evil and suffering in the world, and obviously you can combine them. Let me say a word or 2 more about each of them. As I'm sure you all know, on the Christian worldview, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, God made us in His image. What does that mean? Well, there's lots of literature on this, but philosophers, for a long time, Christian philosophers have agreed at least one of, if not the demarcating feature of human beings, and the imago Dei, is the possession of rational, creaturely freedom. This is the feature that human beings possess that no other created thing does. This is a unique way in which we bear the image of God. God is a free creature with a mind that makes choices. There's no other thing like this in the planet. Now, God made us, importantly, for communion with Him, right? Genesis 1, you get this nice picture that like Adam and Eve and God are just like walking around in the garden together. No barriers between them, right? And this is important, I think, on an emotional level, because you'll talk to someone who maybe does have a child with cancer, or they're losing their parents, or maybe you know people in Ukraine. I have a young woman in our small group right now that knows people that are being directly affected. She's got family over there. And it's hard to keep in view sometimes, but on the Christian worldview, right, our deepest, most basic need is communion with God. God's presence. That's the main thing that we lost in Genesis 3, folks. We're booted from the garden, and now we don't have unabated access and communion with God. Right? So, God is making us into creatures that can enjoy a perfect communion with Him, and God, because He loves us, is willing to do what it takes to make that happen. Right? To draw us to Him again. And suffering might be a necessary instrument I'm going to read to you from C.S. Lewis. It's a great book, The Problem of Pain. Where am I going? 604. 604. Here we go. We all know how contentedly we can rest in our sins and our stupidities. And we can all readily admit that often we ignore pleasures. But pain insists on being attended to. A bad man, happy, is a man without the least inkling that his actions don't answer, that they're not in accord with the laws of the universe. And a perception of this truth lies at the back of the universal human feeling that bad men ought to suffer. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. The idea for the soul-making theodicy is that suffering is an effective instrument in getting you to this place where you can rejoin with God in perfect communion. And I want to focus on that second bit a little bit more, right? If the Christian worldview is right, and you're rejoined with God in eternity, you enjoy an eternity of infinite happiness. Here's a pretty good trade-off, right? A little bit of finite suffering every now and then for, say, what, 80, 100 years optimistically? You trade that off for an eternity of infinite happiness. That's a pretty good trade-off. Right? A little bit of suffering in the grand scheme of things for infinite happiness. One more point. Remember, it's important. We just talked about the passion of Jesus on the cross. Remember, it's not just our suffering that God is willing to use. It's his own suffering. Right? On the Christian worldview, God humbles himself, takes human form, comes down and suffers on our behalf to reconcile us to himself. Right? So it's not like God's just up there super cold pushing buttons to program things and get the right outcome. Right? He laid down his life. It's not just our suffering, it's his own that is used. Okay, but bottom line, God's forming us into creatures that are fit for his kingdom, where we will enjoy infinite happiness. And getting there may require a little bit of pain and suffering. But that's a really good trade-off. Okay, this nice quote from Augustine. Right? God has made us for himself, and we won't be able to rest. We'll be uncomfortable. We'll suffer a little bit until we rest in him. Okay, second, the free will defense. Okay, we have this nice thing from the image of God. We have this creaturely freedom, this reasoned freedom that sets us up to have perfect communion with God. But, sometimes we use our reasoned freedom to do wrong. And often a natural consequence of doing that is pain and suffering. But I want to talk about a more basic point, which is having the kind of freedom that we value, that you value, requires the possibility of pain. This is a point I get to in discussions with a lot of people, not just non-believers, with Christians. For example, when we start talking about the sovereignty of God, why couldn't God just orchestrate things so that we never disobeyed him? And then what I ask people to do is I say, okay, tell me about the world in which there is perfect obedience. Thoroughly imagine it. Tell me about it. And the more you plug more details into that world and imagine it, the more you get the feeling that there is no freedom in this world. There are no free creatures in this world. There are maybe like automata and robots and, non-human animals maybe. But there's no freedom. Freedom requires the possibility to make choices. Good choice, bad choice. The kind of freedom that we value requires the possibility of pain. Sometimes that naturally leads to consequences, and then other times it's a divine response, right, to our poor choices. And here's where the justice aspect comes in. Remember, if God is perfect, perfect in every way. Right? God's justice is just as much an aspect of his perfection as his goodness and his power. What does justice involve? Well, for one thing, what I have on the slide here is it requires apportioning happiness to virtue. That's from a 20th century meta-ethicist W.D. Ross. But in layman's terms, a just world is one in which, like Lewis just said, a just world is one in which people get what they deserve. When you use your reasoned freedom to do wrong, justice requires, some less than optimal outcome for you. Sometimes that happens naturally through what some philosophers have called natural law. It may come now, it may come later, it may come directly, it may come indirectly from God's action. But as a matter of justice, God wouldn't be just if he sat idly by while people do wrong. And I think an effective thing to harp on or focus on with your non-believing friends is, you want a God like this. If you are horrified by the evils in the world, you want a God of justice who is committed to settling it and setting things right. That's his justice, right? But the administration of justice is not always a pleasant thing. The problem of evil is often put in the form of this rhetorical question, like how could a perfectly loving God send people to hell? We don't like to talk about this, but an equally legitimate intellectual question. How could a perfectly just God let any of us in? How could a perfectly just God not inflict some suffering on us? Less fun to talk about, of course, but intellectually, equally pressing, equally puzzling question. We have to have an account of evil in the world that squares with God's justice. And again, it's not all doom and gloom here, right? Again, this is a being you want governing the universe. You don't want an unjust, all-powerful God. This is part of his perfection, right? At bottom, we want there to be a God who will set things right. We're just not always comfortable with what that might look like. Okay, so there's some three general thoughts for you, okay? How does this help, right? Can the Christian worldview explain the suffering, the source of suffering? Well, yeah. Like, I've only been talking for 20 minutes here, and there are a number of things you can say, right? Some suffering in the world is the result of our freedom, which is a good thing. It's better to have free creatures than not. Some suffering is a result of the fact that God is trying to shape us into creatures for perfect communion and bliss with him. Some suffering is the result of natural consequences. Some of it's the result of his administration of justice, right? There are all sorts of things that the Christian worldview has to say about where the evil in the world comes from. Can we justify the presence of suffering? Well, again, right? Here's a pretty good reason for inflicting pain. I was talking to someone up here. It's just like when I tell my daughters when we go to the doctor, like, yeah, your shot is going to hurt, but you'll be immune to this disease for 10 years. Great trade-off. Like 5 seconds of pain for 10 years of immunity. And how much better is this trade-off, right? Infinite happiness, right? That's as good of a justification as you can find, I think, for inflicting suffering or allowing someone to suffer. But also, again, the presence of evil and suffering is justified by the value of freedom and also by God's justice. Does our suffering have significance? Yeah, on the Christian worldview, right? We are a part of a grand redemptive narrative in which God is trying to set the world right. And suffering is an important element in that story. It's not meaningless. This is the kind of thing that I would usually say for a Q&A, but since you asked about natural evils, I think often we undersell or we underappreciate how much went wrong in Genesis 3. And you get hints of this when you get things like how toilsome it will become to work the land. So I think one thing you can say, and we could talk more about this later, but I think one thing you can say is, if you read the grand redemptive narrative of Scripture, which, by the way, I haven't quoted it, but like this book, God's Big Picture, I think is excellent. excellent for giving you a basic understanding of the overarching narrative of Scripture. God sets us up on earth as his stewards. Right? And then basically we abdicate by our sin, our position as stewards of his created world. It's not just human sin that introduces that. It's a disruption in the whole created order. And so I think actually a very simple thing. We don't say like, yeah, okay, do I say this? Yeah, fine, whatever. You can tweet at me later. We don't say things like the people in Haiti are so terrible, there was just bound to be a hurricane coming at them. What you can say is, look, we screwed up the whole world with our sin because it was our job to steward the created order. That's what God put us here for. So when we step out of our naturally designated purpose, it's not just human life that is affected. The natural world is affected too. We could talk more about that. That's only one thing that you can say. Okay, where are we? What's happening? Okay, so notice what I haven't given you. I haven't given you a formula or like some nice process by which you're like, okay, what do we got? We got infant cancer. Here's my process for determining where that cancer came from, why it's justified, and exactly what God's doing with it. Don't think actually that's the effective way to do a theodicy. What's much more effective is awareness of the general reasons that there could be for any evil and suffering in the world. Right? You may not know why this particular evil is happening, but it is a comfort and it is satisfying to know that there is an all-powerful, perfectly good God that has a number of good reasons for allowing or causing things to go as they have. That's why I was giving you those 3 categories of resources. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, we can do it. 10 minutes or less. Here we go. I really want to get this last stuff in, which is why I cut that earlier part really short. So here we go. I want to end by saying this. I think the Christian account of the evil and suffering in the world, it's supported in 2 ways. One, it's supported by the totality of the evidence on the issue and the absence of more compelling competing accounts. Okay, so first, the totality of the evidence. Reasonable people form their beliefs on the basis of all the evidence. Right? Reasonable people don't cherry pick. They don't ostrich and stick their head in the ground and ignore things. They seek out as much evidence as they can get, and they account for all of it. Often in conversations with people, I readily concede that the existence of evil and suffering in the world does constitute some evidence against the existence of God. And indeed, if all you looked at with tunnel vision was like, man, look how crappy the world is, you might actually you might well conclude that there is no God. But there's a whole bunch of evidence that you're ignoring if you just do that, right? Remember, 2 days ago we talked about like how there's all of these proofs for the existence of God. We only had time for 2. There are dozens more. There's all the evidence for the resurrection, for example. Right? And so the question is not just, does the existence of evil in the world provide evidence against the existence of God? It's, does it provide strong enough evidence that it outweighs all of the proofs for the existence of God and all the evidence for the resurrection? And I think fair-minded people often say, well, no, it's not that strong of evidence. Especially when you see that the logical problem of evil fails. The totality of evidence seems to support the existence of the Christian God. We're talking about one argument against dozens. One piece of evidence, one kind of evidence, against dozens on the other side. Encourage people to look at all the evidence. Don't just myopically stare at the suffering in the world. What about the reasons there are to believe in God? Second, remember, this is everyone's task. Making sense of the suffering in the world is not a unique job for the Christian. Everyone has to do this, right? And you guys know by now, maybe this is kind of my shtick, is like, well, what's your answer? What is your account of the evil and suffering in the world? You don't like the picture I'm painting you, paint me a better one. Let me just give you 3 aspects of this, okay? We've talked about freedom, the value of freedom. How do you explain why it's good that there's freedom in the world, even at the cost of suffering? The Christian answer is simple and elegant. There's a God, and we as his image bearers have to have rational creaturely freedom. That's part of why it's good, and it also sets us up for this blissful relationship with God. If you think that creaturely freedom is important, how do you explain the value of that freedom if not by appeal to the Christian God? Second, the objectivity of evil. Stay with me. In order for there to be evil that disproves the existence of God, what does there have to be? It's got to be evil. Real evil. Objective evil. Right? Here's not how the problem of evil goes, right? Well, you know, the world just really isn't catered to my every fancy and whim, and I don't know who's running the show, but I just don't really like how he's doing things. I could have a little bit more money, or I could be a little bit more in shape. I think an easy response to that is like, yeah, but like that doesn't seem like that very serious of a problem, right? The things that drive the argument from evil are these things that are objectively evil and horrifying, right? But now watch this. What did we talk about 2 days ago? How could there be objective evils? Where do objective values come from? In order for there to be objective evils, there have to be objective facts about right and wrong and good and bad. Where do these things come from? The Christian has an easy response, right? This is what the moral argument for the existence of God is for. The moral facts emanate from his character and his decrees. How do you even explain the existence of objective evil, of objective values at all, without something like a perfect God to ground that? Finally, the significance of suffering. How do you make sense of the suffering in the world? How do you imbue it with some significance, if not by the Christian story? We do have a couple minutes. This is the last thing I'll do. I want to read to you one more passage from C.S. Lewis. This is also from his book, The Problem of Pain. What does your picture of the world look like without God? Look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space. It's completely dark, unimaginably cold. The bodies which move in this space are so few and small in comparison with the space itself that even if every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures, it would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than but a byproduct of the universe. As it is, the scientists think it likely that a very few of sons of the space have any planets, and in our system it's improbable that any planet except Earth sustains life, and Earth has existed maybe for millions of years and may exist for millions more. But what is life like while it lasts? It's arranged so that all of its forms can live only by preying on other life forms. In the lower forms, this process entails only death, but in the higher forms, there appears a new quality called consciousness, which enables it to be attended with pain. Creatures cause pain by being born. They live by inflicting pain, and in pain, they mostly die. In other words, to quote philosopher Thomas Hobbes, life is nasty, brutish, and short. The universe is cold and uncaring. You suffer and then you die. What resources do you have to lend some significance to our suffering, so that you don't get saddled with the conclusion that it's just pointless, meaningless suffering and then you die? Again, the Christian worldview has elegant answers here, right? Your suffering is not pointless. Your suffering is being used to prepare you maybe for an eternity of bliss. Your suffering is not pointless. It was required to give you the freedom that you care about. Your suffering isn't pointless. It's the result of a perfect God who is just. You're part of a great story where God is setting the world right, not charging to a meaningless death. How do you explain these things without the Christian resources? It's very difficult to find an account that is equal to the Christian account in simplicity, in elegance, in satisfaction. Right? Remember, if we're Christians, all we have to do is postulate one entity, one being of a certain kind and character, and you get satisfying answers to all of these questions. What do you do if you don't say that? I'll end by saying this. We've already seen, I think, the problem of evil does not show that God can't exist, right? The incompatibility version, the logical problem of evil fails. But I've actually come to think over the years that the existence of evil and suffering in the world is actually a good argument in favor of the existence of God. Because it raises so many philosophical and theological puzzles that are really difficult to answer without subscribing to something like the Christian worldview. So far from being the most devastating objection against Christianity, I have actually come to think this is another tool in the toolkit for the Christian apologist. Looking at the evil and suffering in the world is actually a way to see how it's reasonable to believe the Christian story. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It is 11:45. I think I'm going to do what I did yesterday and just say, let's start doing questions, and if you need to sneak out, just try to do it quietly so that people can hear. And then if it goes on too long, I'll say, let's cut it out. But any questions immediately? Yeah?
I'm just wondering practically, because I think the first day you said that you try to have kind of like a one-sentence answer and then your paragraph answer and then your resources to dive in.
Yeah.
Because I have heard just that question, why does, a good God allow suffering? Do you have something that, in your experience, you kind of start with as your one-sentence answer?
Yeah.
There's so much.
It depends on the person, I would say. I mean, people that I can tell, this is going to be sloppy, but let's carve people into two buckets. People who I would say are struggling with what Will and Craig calls the intellectual problem, and then there's people who are struggling with the emotional problem. People who are struggling with the intellectual problem, I usually pivot to the free will defense. I think it's a very intellectually satisfying response, at least for most people. Look, we're free. Freedom's a good thing. Freedom brings with it the possibility of pain. And then it's just say, hey, that's how I make sense of a lot of these evils. How do you? For people struggling maybe more with the emotional problem, I actually think the soul-making theodicy is more effective, because they have this feeling that the suffering in the world is pointless and maybe God is somehow cruel and doesn't care. And I think it's encouraging to hear, no, the story of Scripture is one on which God does care, and He's trying to bring you into eternal happiness. He's trying to escape you from suffering. So those would be my first two moves. It's not that nice one-sentence thing that I sometimes give you, but I do think it depends on what you sense the person is actually struggling with. Do you want to follow up?
No, that's not.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I had a conversation sort of like this with somebody, and they brought out the infant cancer example.
Great.
In the Bible, there are some examples where someone was suffering and they were healed, and Jesus said, "Go and sin no more." And so they said, "Okay, so that's causal suffering. It's because of what that person did or didn't do that made them come up with this leprosy or whatever." But they're saying the infant is innocent, and the infant has cancer. Clearly, it's nothing the infant did that caused them to have cancer.
Yeah.
So how can a just God allow all of this? And my answer was, well, God has a plan that we cannot completely understand. He said, well, that's intellectually vacuous.
Yeah.
You're escaping here.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered what you thought.
Yeah. I do think, first of all, I'm not surprised that was the response. I do think you should try your... For many people, that response sounds like an appeal to mystery. It just sounds like, well, God's ways are higher than our ways and we can't ever know. And I think there is a point at which it is appropriate to say something like that. But I think there are lots of things you can say before you get to a point like that so that the person doesn't think, Christians don't really care about evil. They just say it's all in God's hands and then they sleep nicely at night, right? I think, we should do our darndest to show that, to emulate or to reflect God's care for the evil and suffering in the world, right? About those specific evils, look, you have a lot of options here. It depends on what your doctrinal leanings are. I wouldn't actually suggest this, but, total depravity is a powerful doctrine. What do you mean innocent? Now, in my experience, that does not intuitively register with most people. That's the kind of thing that only comforts you once you're on the inside, as it were. So I think, it is probably a better move to talk about the benevolent reasons that things like that might happen. And again, I think there are intuitive examples all the time where innocent people are suffering, but you can see the greater good that's brought about by that suffering. And so one thing you could try is, will you concede that there are any times that it's good overall that some innocent people suffer? Maybe it's bad in itself that innocent people suffer, but couldn't it be on the whole good? And maybe you can work from there. But you want to?
No, that's good.
Okay.
That's good.
Yeah. Yes?
Mine is more of a comment. Pain shows us that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And the example of what happens if it's not there are people with leprosy. Leprosy is a neurological disease that it makes us incapable of feeling pain.
Yeah.
And all of the evils that we see with leprosy, loss of fingers and everything, is self-inflicted because they can't.
Yeah, good. I think that's in the spirit of that C.S. Lewis quote that I said, right? Pain is sort of God's megaphone. It gets your attention. It tells you that you're not living right, more than just moralizing that you're not following the right moral rules, right? It's to draw your attention to Him. Right? Not just, hey, shape up and get your life together, but there's a being out there that made the world and that you're not living in a way that pleases Him or according to His design. So I totally agree. Pain gets your attention and it shows you what's wrong. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Would the answer to why would a good God send people to hell, could it be something like, God allows free will, therefore, if you believe in God and want to be with God forever, you can go to heaven and be with God. But if you don't believe in God and don't want anything to do with Him, then He gives you your choice and you can go someplace where you're away from Him forever. Yeah, look, I think, yes, I do think, maybe unbeknownst to you, you're making some doctrinal choices there. So that doesn't appeal to everyone. For example, if you're a traditional Calvinist, that might sound like a little too much freedom. But I'll just sympathize with you by saying this. I find compelling this nice line by C.S. Lewis. He says, the gates of hell are locked from the inside. And the idea is, people who end up in hell are people who want to be separated from God. And if people ask me what hell is, that's usually what I say first. Hell is separation from God. And the people that are separated from God are the people who want to be. So you get more payoff from the free will defense there if you want it. So yes, and then you.
If you'll indulge me, I have just two.
Okay.
So,
I'll try.
It seems to me, both from the stability perspective and the theodicy perspective, that it all comes down to the definition of goodness. To the point where it becomes necessary for us to experience the world we live in order for Christ to come and suffer so that God can demonstrate His great love for us. I don't think you get Christianity without the world we live in.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering about your comment on that, and then also, it seems to me like certain theological positions would be more hard-pressed to address the issue of free will. For example, a determinist would have trouble with freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, look, on the first point, I think maybe I'll just say, I agree. On the second point, I think I'll say, I also agree, but let me add something. I do think if you subscribe to a worldview that goes for what philosophers of action and metaphysicians call hard determinism, you do rob yourself of some resources for giving a good response to the problem of evil, right? You have to do a little bit more fancy footwork to explain how, for example, if there's hard determinism and God sovereignly elects and causes every single event and choice in the world, you got to do some fancy footwork to explain how, for example, it's not actually God that's responsible for our choices, right? And then if the gates of hell are locked from the inside, well, who actually locked them, right? So it is easier. I think it's easier sledding if you don't go down that road. Now, it has been done. There are neo-Calvinist and Reformed theologians who address the problem of evil. But this is one of the reasons I like to, like I said, I tried to stick with what Lewis calls mere Christianity. I tried to give responses. For one thing, I don't want people to come to the gospel in a doctrinally loaded way. Right? I want them to be impressed by the basic tenets of the faith that all Christians have believed since the first century. And so I try not to give answers to questions that would rely on you landing in one sect versus another. So that's my personal strategy. I think it's more effective. But if you have strong doctrinal leanings one way or the other, I think you should also be honest about that. I think, the Lord is sovereign over these things. You should tell people what you believe and why you believe it, and hopefully you can do it in a winsome way. But yeah, I agree with the thrust of your question. So.
Time for one more?
Sure. Last one.
Just, I try to listen to this and poke holes in it as an atheist would.
Good.
Because that's how I want to think through this.
Good.
Your free choice, I love the free choice. I love freedom and I love the one before that.
Making?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Obviously, in-game, eternal bliss.
Yeah.
Right? But as you're walking through the free choice argument, you're suggesting this world would be not interesting if we were all robotic and free choice was removed.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Eternal bliss is a place with no free choice and no evil. That sounds uninteresting. How do you deal with that contradiction, so to speak?
Yeah, good. I think I understand the thrust of the question. I don't think the point of the free will defense is to say that it's the pain and suffering in the world that makes things interesting and valuable. It's the freedom. And so I think the Christian view is one of, like, people who spend eternity with God in heaven are still free. So you still have freedom there. You just have perfected free creatures who sin no more. And that's at least part of the explanation as to why there's no suffering in heaven. So I think one thing to say is that. Another thing to say is, to go back to the soul-making bit, I find that effective for, I'll say this, I'm going to use some words, maybe you know these theories, maybe you don't. The free will defense, I think, partly depends on accepting that freedom in itself intrinsically has value. Lots of people who care about the evil and the suffering in the world are utilitarian or kinds of hedonists. They think suffering and happiness are the ultimate goods. And I'll just say, I think the soul-making theodicy is much more effective for those people. If it's happiness you're interested in, how about an infinity of bliss, right? And one final point on the robots or the automata, I would just say it's a common bit of utilitarian thought since Mill that there are what's called higher and lower pleasures. And so the lower pleasures are, say, pleasures of the body, as one advisor of mine once called them, the pleasures of beer, barbecue, and sex. But there are higher pleasures, right? Like enjoying music, intellectual pleasures, enjoying books, enjoying a beautiful painting. And the idea is those higher pleasures are only available to creatures with rational freedom. Right? And so, yeah, could you have possibly like a heaven full of happy automata? Yeah, but they'd be happy in like the way that a pig is happy. And so what you have to do is press the intuition that the world overall has more happiness with human creatures in it because it's a higher order of pleasure or happiness that would be missing if we weren't around. Okay, I threw a lot back at you. Please come see me if you want to talk more. Okay, man, been so fun to be with you guys. We have one more session tomorrow, Christianity and Science. We're going to go out with a bang. It'll be fun. Come back tomorrow. If you didn't see it, I actually didn't intend that pun. If you didn't see it, I saw lots of people scribbling notes yesterday, so I made a quick handout from yesterday for all of this stuff on the resurrection. It's back there on that silver cart, and you can pick one up on your way out if you like. I'll hopefully see you tomorrow for one more time.